Got it. So I'll start by saying, hi, I'm Alan. I've been with NSF for a little bit over a year now. My background is in glaciology and remote sensing and satellite imagery. I've gotten to work in both the Arctic and the Antarctic as a glaciologist. Done some work in open science and also scientific facilitation. I am joining you today from Williamstown, Massachusetts, the ancestral home of the Mohican people. Thanks to remote work in the pandemic, I'm not actually down in DC. And I'm gonna say this a few times throughout the talk, that if you have questions about NSF, reach out to your program officers. That might be me and that might be other people, but it's a message we're really trying to get out there increasingly. We really want to be responsive to the community, and we can only do that when we have a good dialogue going. So, Polar Cyber at NSF. I might say Polar CI. If you see CI in the slides, that means cyber infrastructure. The program has alternated between having a dedicated program officer and being shared by different program officers. So right now, there's me being dedicated on this. The program helps to build collaborations between the Office of Polar Programs and the Computer and Information Science and Engineering Directorate, and specifically their Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure. I mentioned before, we work in both Arctic and Antarctic, and cyber infrastructure is explicitly included in both of those core program solicitations, but we work all across OPP, all across GEO, all across NSF, and a bit outside of NSF too. But what does it actually mean? Let's start with some definitions and break down this jargon a little bit. So cyber infrastructure is a word that even in this seminal review paper on what does cyber infrastructure mean, they say, yeah, we use it a lot, but maybe we're not always all saying the same thing. So in simple terms, polar, we know that, North or South Pole, and or South Pole. Cyber, a word that probably had its heydays in the heyday of the 80s and 90s, but NSF really continues to use because it does capture this idea of being related to computers, computing, IT, virtual stuff. And infrastructure, meaning all of our basic physical and organizational structures and facilities that are needed to operate. So we put those all together, we get polar cyber infrastructure. So another definition, I'll go through a few different definitions and parts that I want to emphasize here. So cyber infrastructure consists of our computational systems, our data and information management, could be advanced instruments, could be visualization environments. It also includes people who have the skills to run all of these things, build them and make them work and happen. And all of those things linked together by software and advanced networks. So all of these things have to be connected, working with each other, and some definitions also say to improve scholarly productivity and enable knowledge breakthroughs, which we wouldn't otherwise have. Another important part of cyber infrastructure is that it is interoperable and collaborative. You don't just build one thing and call that cyber infrastructure. If it lives on its own in a silo, then it's not part of the cyber infrastructure system, right? And so it incorporates many technologies. That might be high performance computing, it might be storage, it might be networking, it might be services, but they all have to work together. And at every stage of the research life cycle to all work end to end to support the research that we do. And cyber infrastructure encompasses the sharing of common resources, functions, and expertise, as well as lowering the barriers to entry for the development, provisioning, operations, and use of potentially new applications. So we share our infrastructure, and it makes our jobs easier. And so those are also important features. We don't want to be doing things on our own, and we don't want to be making it more complicated. And I'll re-emphasize here that cyber infrastructure comprises both technical and human aspects. So that also can mean training or exchanges or a community organization to better use these tools or build these tools or envision these tools, whatever they might be. So what about the polar side of polar cyber infrastructure? So sorry, I was just making sure I didn't miss anything in the chat there. The polar side means that we are bringing all of those tools, systems, people working together to bear on Arctic and/or Antarctic applications. And so we want polar cyber infrastructure to be embedded in the way that polar scientists work. It is not apart from your research, it is a part of your research, and support the full range of polar research requirements and goals. And so, as I mentioned before, polar cyber infrastructure is included in both the Arctic and Antarctic research NSF solicitations. It's not a separate program, it's part of those. And this is a good time to mention that, for example, when your proposal comes into NSF, you will often tag a particular program, but we program officers will also share things within NSF, can share things within NSF, and so we can do things co-review and co-fund. And so that's one of the things that I also want to emphasize here is that Polar CI doesn't sit alone, siloed away. It is connected to all of these other programs, disciplinary programs that you might also be more used to working with as well. There we go. So this is language from those solicitations that you might be familiar with. It's almost exactly the same language in the Arctic and Antarctic NSF solicitations, and says Polar Cyber Program considers proposals that promote effective collaboration between polar and cyber infrastructure researchers. So we want to get, traditionally we think of these areas of domain scientists, aka polar scientists, and computer scientists or CI experts as being these two separate communities. And we want to work towards a world in which they aren't separate communities, but they're communities that work together. And indeed, people kind of see themselves as moving between these communities, having feet in both of them, not necessarily even thinking of themselves as distinctly a domain scientist or a cyber infrastructure person, but both at the same time. So the Arctic Sciences section, as well as the Antarctic Sciences section, but we're here in an IARPC talk, will also support proposals that provide significant benefit to the polar research community, including this list. And I highlighted that these emphases are mine, the program will support proposals that provide significant community benefit to the research community, that is. And so things where you are working on your own and doing your own individual development become much more relevant to the Polar Cyber Infrastructure Program when they are also demonstrated to have relevance and impact and benefit to the rest of the research community as well. So you could be doing your own algorithm development, and that becomes much, much more relevant once you say, oh, and we're going to share it, and we're going to do these workshops, and we're going to take into account community needs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So things that could fit within Polar CI as examples include helping with data transfer back from remote field locations, long-term sustainable curatorship, standardization, management, discovery of data and metadata, visualizing, using, analyzing, particularly for understanding complexity and data, access and interoperability across scientific disciplines, promoting the effective use of high performance computing for direct and sustainable advances in current Arctic research, and e-learning and educational tools based on cyber infrastructure components. So as you can see there, it's a wide range of things. We try to be inclusive, which can sometimes be a little confusing in and of itself. I also mentioned that Polar Cyber, or the Polar CI program, collaborates with all of the other parts of NSF, in particular the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure, OAC. And what we try to do is to help Polar PIs access these other programs, other opportunities and pots of money and opportunities for submitting proposals. Some that I want to highlight in particular include Cyber Infrastructure for Sustaining Scientific Innovation, so the CSSI program. I'm highlighting that one right now because it's an open solicitation with a deadline in early November. There's 3 different tracks, kind of smaller things, larger things, and bringing tools to sustainability. The idea there is that there is a demonstrated scientific need for some cyber infrastructure, and you're building and deploying that cyber infrastructure. So because this is within OAC, again, that means there's some level of cyber infrastructure research that's happening there, but there does have to be that domain need. And this is where we often get into co-funding with the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure as well. Another program that I want to mention is called Cyber Training, or the Training-Based Workforce Development for Advanced Cyber Infrastructure. You might have seen this one before. The solicitation is currently being renewed, and so we don't have a set deadline for when this next solicitation will be available and when the next deadline will be. It will be sometime in 2022, we're pretty sure at this stage. And so that program, the old solicitation is available online. And from that, you can see that it targets cyber infrastructure users and producers and professionals. You can do one or all 3. There are a range of different activities, audience, and approaches that all focus on training in terms of using and building these skills. So it focuses on the people aspect. And there can be a disciplinary component to that as well. And so that's why I'm emphasizing it here as well. Another program that we cooperate with is the Harnessing the Data Revolution. It's one of those NSF 10 big ideas. It's a huge program. It was not going to fit on that. You can go to a whole webinar just on HDR. But there's a range of data-centric approaches and opportunities, whether that's in transdisciplinary research, building of research institutes, training opportunities, and things like that. So if you are a data-centric scientist, I would really encourage you to check those out. There are lots more. One that many of you might be familiar with is the EarthCube program, for example, run through GEO. The final EarthCube solicitation happened this past year, and we don't know what's going to happen next with that community or following on from it. But whatever it is, the Polar Cyber Infrastructure Program would cooperate with that for sure. And thank you, Steve, for adding that the CSSI deadline is on December 8th. I hope I read that out correctly. The next thing I wanted to say was, again, I mentioned cooperation. Some of that cooperation also happens in terms of facilities that are provided to the research community. And that could be high performance computing investments done through the SIES Directorate, as well as things like cloud computing opportunities. So you might have, or you might not be familiar with NSF's Cloud Bank program. And so that's a program where you can get cloud credits or credits on commercial cloud computing platforms without having to, say, incur overhead at your research institution, and have an organization that helps you manage the credits and costs and allocations and things like that. There's also a program called PATH that provides access to high throughput computing. So it might be distributed in a bunch of places as well, but helps you crank through jobs. Those are sometimes available on a solicitation by solicitation basis. But we are also exploring what additional solicitations they might be made available on. And so if you would particularly find programs like that useful, reach out. We can have a discussion and see how we can help make those available as well. So I want to break up the next little bit of this webinar into 2 main areas. One, kind of the big core pieces of the Polar CI program, and I'll talk about some examples of other highlights of, I guess, smaller or project-based things that have been funded by the Polar Cyber Infrastructure Program. One that hopefully almost anyone that engages with IARPC will be familiar with is the Arctic Data Center. You can find a lot more at arcticdata.io, but they are the primary data and software repository for the Arctic Sciences section. It is focused on Arctic It's a regional repository as opposed to a disciplinary repository, which is a fairly unique approach within NSF. In their most recent renewal, there's a renewed focus on social sciences in particular. And in addition to storing your data and your metadata, they have a whole bunch of different data management tools, opportunities for training and outreach, opportunities for fellows programs, community support services. They work with you as you submit your data to help make sure that it is as findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable as possible. They work with you if there's sensitive aspects of your data, whether it should be shared publicly or not, and how it should be done. They help provide tools for curation, some things you might have seen called portals that help you package your data or provide it in context of other data sets. They are part of the Data One network of repositories, so you can do searches between other repositories as well to help you find other data sets more easily. And they participate on the Arctic Data Committee that sits under IASC and SAON. So it's an international committee focusing on Arctic data. So we fund that. We fund the US Antarctic Program Data Center, which is more or less the Antarctic colleagues of our Arctic Data Center. Similarly, they are a data and metadata repository. They also are a project catalog where all Antarctic NSF-funded Antarctic projects have to register their projects, so that then the USAP Data Center can go report those to the Antarctic Master Directory for Antarctic Treaty compliance. As I said, they are a data repository. Often Antarctic data will go into a discipline-specific repository first. That's totally great. The metadata just we ask that they be submitted back to the USAP DC. The Antarctic glaciological collection is in particular held at the USAP DC. And then they also do things like international representation on SCAR committees, and they provide user services like things like helping with your data management plan when you submit NSF proposals, and they have training webinars and things like that available as well. One you might be less familiar with is the Antarctic Meteorological Research and Data Center, depending on your discipline. If you're a meteorologist, then this is going to have all of the data that you use, but it's a discipline-specific repository for Antarctic atmospheric sciences and meteorology. They, like our other repositories, try and store our data for the long term and make it as fair as possible, so that's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. They offer up a variety of different data sets, all citable, as well as metadata to help find data, whether that's weather stations or satellite deposits and things like that. They're used in both research and operations, and they're working on the future of their repository as well. So keep checking back to see more updates from that group as well. And then we also fund the Polar Geospatial Center. And so they provide high resolution satellite data and tasking for federally funded researchers in particular, but they also have freely available data products like the Arctic DEM, aerial photography, different maps, the reference elevation model of Antarctica, some other data products, like I think there's like a mineral map of the dry valleys in Antarctica, things like that, tons more elevation data, as well as general user services and geospatial support, in particular for NSF-funded researchers. They have training and training materials that are freely available, and also connections with the community for people that use that high resolution data to be able to share expertise and knowledge with each other as well. I'll just remind everyone that OPP has a data policy, and all of those core programs, in particular the USAP DC and the Arctic Data Center, help the research community comply with our OPP data policies. And that's, your data has to be shared openly. You have to at least report your metadata to our official repositories, and you have to do that within, depending on which program you're funded by, within 6 months up to a couple years from when your project starts, and definitely by the end of your project. There's a question that's coming in now of whether there's a preference, whether data should be submitted to USAP DC or discipline-specific repositories. And usually we encourage people to submit them to the discipline-specific repositories, especially on the Antarctic side, where basically we want to make sure the data is as discoverable and usable as possible. So if there is a good long-term repository that's discipline-specific, go for it. And then just make sure that your metadata is fully deposited within the USAP DC or the Arctic Data Center, whichever it may be. You might have a polar data set, right? And so maybe your data sits in the Arctic Data Center and then the metadata are described in the USAP DC or vice versa. We like to see all of those things reported in your annual and final reports. You can do that in the products section of your reporting. If you're Antarctic, we want you to register your project as soon as possible. And all of these data centers like to have an ongoing relationship with you where you provide information about your project and update it along the way. And you're not just waiting until the last 3 days of your project to shove that data in there. You can find out more in NSF publication 16-055 on the data policy. Some of you also might have seen this Dear Colleague letter on supporting data and sample reuse in polar research that came out earlier in 2021. This is not a new solicitation, but it is a tool that we are using to encourage submission of proposals that use existing data or physical samples or non-physical samples to facilitate, or proposals that facilitate the reuse of existing data or leverage and make publicly available data or samples that are currently unavailable and inaccessible. So things like data rescue and reuse projects. And so basically, we want people to be able to reuse data. You researchers spend a lot of effort in collecting data, and we want to make sure that that is respected. It gets reused into the future. We also know that fieldwork is especially hard during COVID times, and we want to make sure that people recognize that NSF doesn't think that doing fieldwork has to be part of being a polar scientist. It certainly can be, but it doesn't need to be. And so we also want to make these polar data as fully compliant as possible with the FAIR principles and the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance, compliant with that data policy that I just mentioned. So applies to all areas of polar research, and you can find out more in NSF 21-041. Something else that I also really want to mention is that polar cyber infrastructure and how it works with broader impacts. Broader impacts are an important part of all NSF-funded programs. Polar cyber infrastructure is not accepted from that. And so when you're thinking about your science, broader impacts should be part of that. Cyber infrastructure also includes people. And so we want to make sure that that is part of it. And so cyber infrastructure can either facilitate broader impacts, which could include broadening participation, but doesn't necessarily need to be. Some examples of that could include research experiences, using real polar data and code in teaching or in training opportunities, virtual learning or field trips or interactive modules, public engagement, telepresence, virtual or augmented or mixed reality experiences, or those things to help you visualize and analyze data. And we want to recognize that access and equity is also a challenge, especially in the Arctic, relative to the Antarctic. That is where we don't have populations that are living and working so much. And so current mechanisms for that could be through the Polar Cyber Infrastructure Program, but also could be the IU's EHR program, DRK-12, and ASIL, the Advancing Informal STEM Learning. And if you want to read up a little bit more, there's always all sorts of great conversations happening within the research community around broader impacts. There is an interesting NSF blog post around broader impacts that I thought provided some good perspectives, and that's linked right there as well. So I want to give, I know I've been talking for quite a while. I want to give a couple highlights and then a couple last notes, and then we'll wrap up to give us lots of time for questions. So I'm just going to share examples of a few of the types of things that have been funded in the recently by the Polar Cyberinfrastructure. I know that some of the PIs and participants on these projects are on this webinar. So if you have more things to add, or I get something wrong, please do add it in the chat. I would happily stand corrected if I don't want to mess things up. So the first example is the G-Hub, or Glaciology Hub, Glacier Hub, a science gateway for the ice sheet science community, which has been supported through Polar Cyber, but through the EarthCube and CSSI programs. And so the G-Hub houses data, computational tools, and educational materials. Users can browse data sets, they can contribute data, they can run, develop, and share different computational and visualization tools, including those that leverage supercomputing. You can find out resources for teaching and outreach and connect with each other. And so they aim to grow with additional data sets and tools contributed by the ice sheet science community. And if you're on CryoList, you might have just seen an advertisement advertising G-Hub just this past week as well. Another example is of a very recent award is one of these HDR, or Harnessing the Data Revolution Institutes. Everything has an acronym, so this one is HARP, or Harnessing Data and Model Revolution in Polar Regions. And so this will be a research hub where experts in data science, as well as Arctic and Antarctic science, and cyber infrastructure in academia, government, and private sectors come together to develop transformative and integrative data science solutions to reduce uncertainties in projecting future sea level rise and climate change. That's a whole lot going on, but one of the things that our new or relatively new, been around for over a year, one of the things that our NSF director has really emphasized is building partnerships, whether that's across disciplines, across sectors, and on topics with societal benefit, like this project. And so as an example, this program is going to be investigating the potential of new physics-aware data science and machine learning approaches to address things like Arctic issues through navigating the new Arctic solicitation, climate change, and sea level. A smaller or more focused program or project is this one called Generation of High-Resolution Surface Melting Maps over Antarctica using regional climate models, remote sensing, and machine learning. So this is a polar Antarctic application of machine learning, in particular training generative adversarial networks with the outputs of a regional climate model and remote sensing data to generate really high resolution 100-meter maps of surface melting, and then sharing them out with the community. And they will also have a workshop to help build community around the machine learning techniques that are being used in this area. So you can see how it's both the computing aspect as well as the community aspects that are being emphasized. Other types of programs that I want to emphasize, we've supported a few different workshops over the course. These are either recently happened or going to occur soon. An Antarctic cable workshop. What if we put a cable down to McMurdo Station? How would that change the science that we would get done? You probably saw some discussion around that, and the whole workshop report is available on that website. Please do check it out. Another upcoming workshop is on technology developments to advance Antarctic research. And another workshop we're supporting is on evaluating the scope and value of a biological repository of Antarctic specimens, and that would have a cyber component as well. We also were able to support supplements to existing awards. Supplements, as you might be familiar with in NSF, address the original scope of the award, but can be in response to things like COVID or other changes or impacts to the program. So if you're considering a supplement, reach out to your cognizant program officer and have a chat. And those are typically considered at the end of the award, because that's when we know the full impacts. A few final things that I'll mention because I have a wrapped audience. There's a new NSF PAPPG that came into effect earlier this month. So new things like new planning grant proposals, which is pretty cool. Updated career life balance, supplemental funding requests, things like updated formatting and more. So if you're thinking about an NSF proposal, make sure to check that out. At the GEO level, so the next level kind of above the Office of Polar Programs, They also have a cyber infrastructure page with more information, and you can check it out there. This is not a long enough webinar to talk about all of the different mechanisms that NSF has and uses to support all sorts of different science, whether that's for undergraduates, graduates, mid-career, early career, primarily undergraduate institutions, minority serving institutions, different types of programs that might be in response to quickly changing scenarios, high risk, high reward projects, many, many more. In particular, though, I should mention that OPP has a postdoc program with a deadline early next year as well, and an upcoming webinar in, I want to say, early November for that. And more information is available if you just search for the OPP PRF. So all that to say, please do your homework, check out all of the news available via IARPC collaborations, NSF events, our OPP newsletter, and upcoming office hours that both the Arctic and Antarctic sections are going to be having. Write up a one-pager with your idea, and then reach out to your program officer to ask questions and talk more. We love to hear your ideas and questions, and I look forward to hearing, hopefully, a bunch of questions from this community now. So thanks.
Thank you, Alan, for a fantastic presentation. So I'll now open it up for Q&A. You can put your questions in the chat if you prefer to do that, or you can use the raise hand function, and I will invite you to come off mute. Let's see, Corey, I see you've got a hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Alan. I don't have my video on because I have bad internet connection, which actually relates to the question I have. Given the demands for proper and deeper engagement, kind of in Arctic sciences specifically, with local communities in the Arctic, and also considering the lack of supportive infrastructure located in Arctic communities, the lack of office space, actual computers, and the extremely expensive and unreliable internet access. My question has to do more about, and you could answer this for a layman's term because I'm kind of new to this infrastructure discussion. My question is, how does NSF feel about investing in infrastructure that would require ongoing operational costs? Because I know that there's always that question of who's going to continue paying for the spaces and stuff like that. But I guess, how do you feel about, does NSF willing to invest in like actual infrastructure? Because that seemed to be a glaring need that we've all recognized during COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Corey. I think that NSF does make sustained investments in some areas of cyber infrastructure. Some of that, is readily available at the supercomputer level. Some of that is readily seen at the continued support for things like the Arctic Data Center. And so I think the important part is understanding what community benefit or research community benefit those sorts of investments would be able to respond to, and what sorts of investments, or sorry, what needs they would be responding to, and what sustained investment would look like. That's a really broad sort of answer. And so the other thing that I want to say is that at the Cyber Infrastructure program, one of the things we think about is making sure to serve all levels of the NSF Arctic or polar research community, right? Not all of the investment goes towards just the super big supercomputer stuff, right? And so everyone within Arctic research should be engaging with cyber infrastructure at all levels. And so we want to make sure that all of those communities are being served as well. I hope that sort of answered your question, but please do follow up if you have more.
Could really quickly, the realization I have is that in research institutions, that the space is always kind of really available for the most part, office space, which could be dedicated to that. But the problem is that when you demand hundreds of researchers to work with locals, a lot of times they just don't have the actual office space, the actual, Sherry Fox mentioned this in one of her presentations on, they don't have the actual office space, the actual infrastructure, and then the lack of the internet, and that's a huge glaring need across the board. So just wanted to point that out. Thank you very much, Alan.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. And I think it's important that any NSF project include in their budget the things that we need to get those things done. And that includes both the physical spaces, physical tools, and virtual spaces and virtual tools necessary, for sure.
Can I say something, Alan?
Yeah,
Kevin.
please, Kevin, go ahead. Yeah. NSF colleague here.
I'm in OCE, and I'm not as deeply involved in the cyber infrastructure, although I am on the geoinformatics working group there in Geo. I just wanted to sort of respond to Kari's question about the infrastructure and point out that there is actually a fairly substantial program that bridges the gap between what we call major research infrastructure, which is the MRI program, and then the MREFC, which is the major research facilities. So the gap is bridged by this program called MSRI, Mid-Scale Research Infrastructure. And the solicitation kind of runs on I don't know, maybe a biennial basis. It just closed this past year for the most recent solicitation, but it might address the question that Kari had. And the next solicitation probably will be in a couple of years, but that would give you time to sort of look at the solicitation. There's two levels. There's the MSRI 1, which is up to $20 million, and then there's the MSRI 2, which is above $20 million, but below the sort of the level of the MREFCs. And those obviously specifically do address infrastructure needs and building of actual facilities. So I would encourage you to have a look at that within the NSF portfolio of programs.
Thanks, Kevin. Jessica, I think you had your hand raised next.
Thanks. It's great to hear more about all of this stuff, Alan. One of the questions that I have is obviously a big piece of cyber infrastructure is also compute, in particular a compute environment that can take advantage of all of these great tools and pieces and programs that people are putting together, and also, potentially decrease the amount of data that we need to ship to one another. And obviously that requires a lot of cross-platform, cross-project, collaboration, and then also I'm thinking cross-agency collaboration, and I'm wondering if you can speak to any of the sort of compute infrastructure side of things.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think within NSF, a lot of the bigger compute infrastructure stuff gets handled not so much within OPP. I think a lot of what we try and do is get polar scientists to use those bigger things that get invested in, whether it's stuff at NCAR or Exceed or things like that. And we want to make sure that polar scientists are able to take advantage of those tools. That said, if there are things that those tools aren't serving, aren't providing, things that would reasons that they aren't working for polar scientists, we can also help be a conduit back to those other funders and stakeholders to be like, hey, you know what? This tool isn't working for our science community because of ABC. What can we do about that? And so hopefully, my polar CI budget is not enough to buy a supercomputer, but it is to hopefully to be like, hey, we have a focus on this. It is really important to polar science that we do get to use these tools. And so having the feedback from users like you would be really helpful. That said, I'll also mention that things like training and community building workshops to kind of build up that voice so that it's a voice of a user community or things like that certainly would fall within the remit of the Polar CI program as well. I see we have one question in the chat from Margaret Rudolph saying, following up on Corey's question, what about addressing the barriers to NSF grants for Indigenous, regional, and tribal organizations? That is a great question, Margaret, and definitely something that the Polar Cyberinfrastructure program is not alone in considering. And thank you for those links, Kevin, to the different MSRI programs. And so one of the things that I, as a program officer, want to emphasize is that I try and be as available as possible to any incoming questions or concerns so that we can talk more about how programs could fit into existing NSF programs. One of the things that we also emphasize within the Polar programs in particular is that we don't generally have deadlines, except even for a postdoc, it's just a target date. It's not even a strict deadline. And so we can work with different regional and tribal organizations to take the time to get things right, and so they don't have to be working towards a deadline. And then we also work with other programs across the foundation as well. There are, you're probably familiar with it, there's some, in particular, Arctic focused resource pages around community and tribal engagement as well that we can follow up and put on the event link afterwards. Thanks for the question, Margaret. And again, if I didn't answer it, follow up with more in the chat, please. Steve, it looked like you had your hand raised next.
Yes, thank you. So I work for the Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory down at the South Pole, and we are looking at the possibility of applying some AI and machine learning techniques, to our online facilities for data reduction and possibly power efficiencies and things along those lines. There are several other experiments that we might collaborate with or that might benefit from this sort of thing. Is that the type of solicitation that might be of interest to you, or is that something that we file through other areas, but can we tag it in some way that would bring it to your attention, and how would that flow?
Yeah, I don't want to comment too much on any particulars of your idea without getting into a little bit more. If you,
Yep.
but feel free to send a one pager and we can talk about it more. It might fit in Polar CI. It might fit better in one of these OAC solicitations. But what I will say is that in all of these different OAC solicitations, things like that, either I or another person from Polar programs sit on a working group. And so they will be like, oh, that's a Polar one, Alan or someone else should look at it. And so we will help see it through review, and yeah, sometimes we had reviewers, sometimes we just are aware that it's there, and can make sure that it gets a Polar eye on it for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Steve. Anthony, I think you had your hand raised next.
Yes, so one issue with researchers in Antarctica, especially over the winter, is the government use restrictions on internet, right? Because the winter rovers are basically stuck there, and the only connection that they have to the outside world is the internet. And some of the types of uses of the internet that they might want to have are forbidden by government networks. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if something could be done, like to have a virtual private network only for the winter rovers that would allow them to use that channel, and the government wouldn't necessarily know what's going on over that channel or what's happening, because it would be the private channel for the private use of the winter overs.
Yeah, I think that anyone to Antarctica who has been to Antarctica can very much sympathize with just how limited the internet is there. Just as an example, for people who aren't aware, the internet connection to somewhere like McMurdo Station is basically on the level of a well-connected house in the rest of the continental United States. Except instead of being shared by 4 people, it's shared by, say, 1,000. Or in the case over winter, 100. And then South Pole is even less connected than that. They're literally scrounging room on communication satellites that are falling out of their intended orbits. As the specific super question about setting up a VPN or changing use, that definitely falls more in terms of the operations side and would be managed through the Antarctic Infrastructure and Logistics Program and not the Polar Cyberinfrastructure Research Program. So I'm afraid I don't have a really good answer for you, but some of the folks in AIL would be the place to direct that question, and I can help you find the right person later on if you'd like.
Okay, thanks.
We have time for a couple more questions if anyone has them. Timothy, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, Alan. Thanks for that talk. I was wondering, I was part of a recent effort to look at the performance of ice sheet models and compare how ice sheet models are doing at reproducing observed sea level change and observed ice sheet changes. And it looks like a lot of the models are not necessarily sort of hitting the marks that we would like to see. And I think that I'm not an ice sheet modeler myself, but my understanding from that community is that a big part of that is due to the really extremely limited resources that a lot of those in the ice sheet modeling community contend with, that they're sort of running on their local lab servers or their university provided HPC setups. And so I'm wondering, for the purpose of sort of making higher confidence projections of ice sheet change, you know, in anticipation of AR7, if NSF might be able to better facilitate that and kind of operationalize some of these models in a way that's beyond just sort of 3-year increments of PI-driven science questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so many pieces of that. So I'm going to try and answer, and if I miss pieces of it, let me know. The 3-year aspect, we'll start there, that the investments that we make in computing or NSF makes are definitely longer term. And as you might be familiar with, getting some allocations on some of these large facilities that are invested in by the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure is somewhat trivial, to be honest. It can be really easy to get some allocations. Now, if you need something huge, that's not always the case. And you know, there are programs where we can fund slightly longer awards, things like that. You know, maybe it's all the way up to 5 years, but versus sustained investment can be a little harder. With an Arctic focus, you know, if it's a focus on observing, sometimes that can be done through another program. In terms of how, say, the Polar Cyber Infrastructure Program might be able to respond to something like this, I think there's a few different aspects, right? There's the aspect around, is the bottleneck getting the scientists to be able to use those bigger resources, right? Is it a training and access issue there? Or, so is it skills building? You know, that's one piece. Is it the piece of like, no, we have the skills, but just getting the allocations and that sort of thing is the bottleneck. Like, that's something that we could address differently, whether it's through saying, you know what, we're going to focus on, you know, talking to the people who run particular facilities, or we're going to invest a bunch in cloud credits because we don't know exactly what we're going to need when, but we need to be able to scale, and that's our challenge, right? And that would be a different type of proposal. So those are just a couple things off of the top of my head, and I would love to hear, you know, maybe in a later conversation, what the G-Hub folks would say about that, because that's one of the things that they're also talking about in particular, is that interoperability of different pieces of ice sheet modeling and tools facilitated by, in some cases, high performance computing resources.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tim.
Corey, I briefly saw your hand go up. Did you have a follow-up question?
Actually, I just had another question about location of data centers that I was curious about. And again, this is from a total layman's term. But I read the article in the AOS about the amount of water that some data centers use, and especially in places where it's increasingly low. I just was curious, is there any discussion about moving north, or even putting data centers potentially up in the Arctic, US Arctic maybe? And then followed up by the other question of, do we have data centers that NSF pays for in Antarctica?
Yeah, great question. And so a few different pieces to that. The USAP data center is based out of Columbia, so New York City area. Our Arctic data center is in Southern California right now. They are both backed up in other areas. And I couldn't tell you exactly where the server farms that back up all of those data are. They are periodically recompeted. And so there are both locally, so there's the opportunity for cooperations and change in where those data centers are supported. There's a bunch of computing infrastructure in Antarctica, but there is not, I guess, an NSF central kind of research data center. They're more operations focused or focused on particular projects. Like, for example, the IceCube neutrino observatory has a huge, well, I say huge, it's not, NCAR supercomputer huge, but a large computing facility at the South Pole to deal with all of the data that they're collecting there, partly to help compress all of that data down so they can send bits and pieces of it back through the slow internet connection. And then they physically mail back hard drives to the United States to then be processed later on. So thanks for the question. No, it's a great question, and something that all of our computing and research centers do try and think about is the sustainability of their operations, to make sure that they're doing as much as they can to reduce the carbon impact of the computing that they do.
We're at the top of the hour. Alan, do you have any final wrap up that you'd like to share?
No, just thanks so much to all of the attendees, and please do feel free to reach out with more questions or comments later on.
Great, thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks Alan for this great presentation. So this has been recorded. It will be posted on the event page and on our YouTube, probably by the end of the day, but definitely by the end of the week. And I'll also post the links that we shared in the chat. So thanks everyone, have a wonderful day.
Great, and thanks IARPC for hosting this. It's been really great.